audience.
Not to announce the audience.
So I want to thank all of my colleagues from the Health Policy and DHHS subcommittees for coming in this morning for this very special meeting. January is National Human Trafficking Awareness Month. The actual day is on Saturday, the 11th. And so what is human trafficking? It sounds so scary. It sounds so foreign. It only happens in other places. It only happens in movies with Liam Neeson. But the reality is that we have individuals out there, friends, family, relatives, who are vulnerable and exploited. And that's what we want to bring to light here. So about 5 years ago, I made a friend in Ruth Rondon, who is a survivor, and she is here to tell her story. And the very important takeaway that I have with this is that with our initiatives with the CARES Task Force that Representative Appel and our colleagues have been doing over the past few years, and addressing the mental health needs of the people of Michigan and, of course, of our vulnerable individuals, is that human trafficking ties in with this, with childhood trauma and setting these kids up for being vulnerable and easy to take advantage of. So Ruth is going to tell us about her story, but she's also going to tie in ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, which hasn't been done at a state level. And I so appreciate your efforts on this, and thank you for being here today, Ruth. Ruth Rondon.
Members of the committee, I appreciate your time. In 1988, I was in jail doing 6 months for drug possession. I was 33 years old. When I went in, I wasn't even 100 pounds and I looked like hell. I was exhausted after being trafficked and drug addicted for 18 years. By the time I was released, I was drug-free and I was much healthier. And I was once again determined to start a new life. I was finally able to do it this time because, for one thing, my family took me back in. I'm very fortunate. I had a safe place to go. Since then, I remained gainfully employed. I became a contributing member of society. And I was consistent on following the 12-step program of Narcotics Anonymous. I worked hard at making amends. And I focused on self-improvement. And all of that paid off immensely. But for a long time, I still felt like there was something missing. And it was so frustrating because I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Until I discovered the A study at age 58. The A study pushed me to revisit some very important steps of the 12-step program, especially step number 4, which reads, we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Years ago, I did take this step, but the A study made me realize that I needed to dig deeper. For those who never heard of the study, Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Onda are the A study researchers. I had the great honor of meeting with Dr. Felitti, and I'm so excited that he supports my work. A little bit about the study. The study began in the late 1990s. It started to get more attention in 2016. There were 17,000 middle-class urban Americans involved in the study, and it links child abuse to the risk of chronic diseases. The researchers created a questionnaire that lists 10 childhood traumas that people can check off to come up with their own A scores. Scores of 4 or higher are considered serious. And the most obvious medical problem of high A scores is mental health issues, like post-traumatic stress disorder and risky health behaviors. Hundreds of additional studies have been conducted based on the A study. Now we have the resilience questionnaire, and I think you all have that in front of you, right? This is what Dr. Vincent Felitti says about human trafficking victims. They are a group to which the A study directly applies and represent a population that will continue to add to the economic burden of chronic diseases on society if the proper public health attention is not given to this widespread problem. This is exactly why a trauma-informed care approach is so important in any given situation involving a traumatized victim. And this is exactly why we need policies that will enhance resilience in our children to fend off the effects of ACEs. In 2013 is when I first heard the study and about human trafficking. And I knew right away that I was a victim. And I wanted my story to be told. There were so many crimes committed against me that I never got justice for. But I didn't think I'd be able to tell my story because, for one thing, my memory failed me. And I tried hard to forget those 18 years of being trafficked and drug addicted. The traumas and the fear and the shame wouldn't let me forget. And it was just too painful to try to put them into words. Dr. Bezel van der Kolk says, a traumatic experience is so sudden and so overwhelming that it cannot be put into words. He says trauma escapes language and causes memory loss. This explains, in part, why I had such a hard time processing my traumas with my therapist. It also explains why traumatized victims are not good witnesses on the witness stand. Another obstacle I was faced with is, how do I tell my family? After everything I put them through, I'm sure the last thing they wanted to hear me say was that I was a victim. And the last thing I wanted to do was run a guilt trip on them. I'm the baby of 6. All 6 of us were abused and neglected at home. I guarded my trafficking secret from all of them for years. My drug addiction became obvious in my early 20s or so, but human trafficking wasn't even a word back then. And for a long time, I myself didn't even know that I was a victim. So with all these obstacles, without the words, and with a bad memory, how can I tell my story? Just before I retired, it dawned on me that most of my life is recorded in public records. So I did a lot of painful research, trying to make sense of my life. Then the Human Trafficking Law Clinic at the U of M helped me retrieve my police records and criminal charges. As I searched through these records, I felt the fear and the shame, as if it was happening all over again. I was a mess all over again. And I knew I couldn't continue on this dark path alone. So I signed up for advocacy services at the YWCA of West Central Michigan. And I had a wonderful therapist who walked alongside me on this research journey. She was the director of the the Rape Crisis Center. She allowed me to unload it all on her. And it was her calming presence that helped me persevere to the end. After a couple of years of this hard work, I was finally able to put my life story and some of my traumas into words. This was huge for me. This is when my mind stopped spinning. This kind of reflection is so healing. I recommend this kind of reflection to anybody who longs to make sense of their life, especially traumatized victims and human trafficking victims. Making sense of our stories helps us make sense of our mere existence. Now I understand why mental health professionals encourage their clients to keep a journal. Doing this difficult inner work allowed me to change the way my story ends. In my research, I learned how abuse is passed on from generation to generation and from era to era. It's all because of toxic shame. My parents, for instance, carried a lot of shame, and they passed it down to all of us. Our mom was a battered woman, and our dad was a raging alcoholic. He was in World War II. Neither one of them ever came to understand their own ACEs and release the pain and the shame from it. So they passed it down to all of us, unknowingly. I learned about life, sex, dating, and even puberty, all on my own, with no guidance. I learned the hard way, just like I'm sure they did. My mom and I, we were blessed to have had the opportunity to become the best of friends before she died. My dad died before we had the chance to rekindle our relationship. I can forgive them both It's so much easier to do now because in my research, I learned that they had even less resources available to them in their lifetime than I had in mine. In my grandparents' and my parents' era, there was no such thing as domestic violence or a rape crisis center. Women didn't even have rights to divorce. War veterans, they suffered in silence themselves because nobody knew how to treat post-traumatic stress disorder back then. It was called shell shock. I'm sure long after the war was over, it lived on in my dad's head for years. We are going to flip it. Even though I can see now why I made those bad choices and become drug addicted, I can also see how I myself passed my own shame on and how I hurt so many as an adult and as a hardcore drug addict. History will repeat itself if you don't understand it. I'm doing what I can to break this cycle. Understanding leads to forgiveness and apologies, and they're both contagious. I want to make a note here. Forgiving others is not a necessary component of recovering from sex trafficking. It's a very personal decision. Forgiving ourselves is key to setting victims free. So how did it all start for me? From my research, I learned that my ACEs, my adverse childhood experiences, they groomed me for trafficking way before I met my trafficker. Not only was I abused and beaten and neglected at home, I was also bullied in school. And unknown to my family, I was raped several times before I was 13 years old. Carrying the shame of so much abuse at such a young age, it's what made me easy prey for traffickers. Not only did my parents fail me, the whole community, the whole system failed me. When I was 10 years old, I was raped by a stranger who lured me away from my sister and friends when we were at a shopping mall. When I told my parents, they exploded. They said I was a stupid whore, and my father beat me. So when I was raped again at age 12 by another predator in the neighborhood, I wasn't about to tell anybody about this rape. But when I was raped again at age 13, I couldn't hide this one from anybody. I was gang raped at a beer party by two grown men who bought beer for us kids in the neighborhood. I was so traumatized by this rape. All I could do was kick and scream, and I wouldn't talk to anybody. I was brought to the hospital by ambulance. There, I was interrogated by the police like I was the criminal. They threatened to take me to jail if I didn't talk. My parents, the police, and the hospital, they all knew I was raped. But nobody considered going after the rapist, even after the hospital told them that I had an STD. I was admitted to a mental hospital the very next day for 9 months. There, they tried to figure out what was wrong with me. Why was I so promiscuous? I thought everybody was blaming me because I was just a stupid whore, like my parents said. I thought I was beyond redemption, and I wanted to die. Dr. Robert Onda says, when people behave in apparently self-destructive ways, it's time to stop asking what's wrong with them and start asking what happened to them. By focusing only on my bad behavior, they all missed an opportunity to uncover the real criminals here and the other rapists and abusers in my life. Obviously, nothing changed when I got out of the mental institution. So when this sweet-talking boyfriend came around, when I was 15, he saw me as easy prey. Because I was easy prey. It was written all over my forehead. I was still desperate for love and attention. He was able to talk me into doing anything he wanted. He agreed with me that my family didn't love me. He said he would take care of me. I thought I had finally found my hero. He promised me the world, and I believed him. He took me shopping, bought me new clothes. When he told me his age, I felt privileged that a 27-year-old would be interested in me. And I told him all of my problems because I felt safe with him. When I confided in him about the rapes, this man made me believe I was stupid too for letting those men have me for free. This added to my shame. I believed him. After several months of dating my hero, he very cleverly tricked me into walking right into a gang rape. Traffickers who pose as boyfriends very cleverly get their victims to agree to help them with some kind of a hardship after they groom them with false promises and gifts. Then they forever blame them for walking into the abuse and for getting arrested. This is what happened to me. And I came to believe that it was all my fault because I did agree to go to the gambling house with him to try to help him win some money back that he lost the night before. I had no idea how I could help him win that money back. I was so naive. At the time, I didn't know the gambling house was also a drug house and a brothel, and I figured he would appreciate it if I helped him out somehow. I had no idea that there were 4 grown men there, eagerly waiting for my arrival. My trafficker, or my boyfriend, apologized for the pain I endured. And he thanked me at the same time. And he reminded me that I agreed. I could never admit this to anybody. I was ready to guard this secret with my life. From that day on, he was no longer my hero. This was the beginning of 18 years of being trafficked. He forced me onto the street, and he beat me on a regular basis. But he continued to always apologize, and I accepted every time because his apologies and his approvals made me feel safe again. I was so confused, just like he wanted me to be. I learned later in life that this is called the Stockholm Syndrome, or trauma bonding. I took all this confusion and shame with me into adulthood at age 18 and beyond because I was suffering from relational poverty. There was nobody in my life to help me undo that confusion and break free from the cycle of abuse and shame that I was caught up in. As a teenager and as an adult on the street, I was repeatedly raped and beaten. I attempted suicide several times. I jumped out of windows to avoid beatings, and I was thrown out of cars. I jumped in cars with men who had every intention on killing me. Tell me, what little girl dreams of growing up to live like this? And I was even visiting the emergency department on a regular basis for beatings, for all kinds of infections and female health problems. And all the healthcare workers just looked the other way. And even today, I'm still looking for somebody to help me figure out how that affected me. At age 65, I still have health problems, and I don't know if it's because of that. My boyfriend introduced me to heroin when I was 16 years old, and I fell in love with it. It altered my reality. By the time I was 17, I was drug addicted. I had a lengthy police record, and I was a high school dropout. I knew my family wasn't proud of me. How could I be proud of myself? I believed there was no hope for me. My traffickers were also my drug suppliers, and my family couldn't figure out why I kept defending my abusive boyfriends. They got so sick of the lies and all my chaos, getting calls from the jails and the hospitals all the time. They had to let me go. When I was a teen, my siblings were starting their own families. They expected me to be a good role model to their children. After all, I am their aunt. I blamed them for years too. I accused them of abandoning me. I expected them to parent me. None of us knew what we were dealing with back then. None of us did. We had no resources. In adulthood, I do not claim to be a victim 100% of the time. I became a hardcore drug addict. I was not pleasant to be around, to put it pleasantly. In adulthood, this life did not continue just because I was addicted and just because I was brainwashed by my traffickers as a teenager. I can name 5 other attributes that kept me trapped and kept me dependent on my trafficker. I don't have time to go into all 7 of these, but I do want to focus on corruption for now. As we all know, there is corruption and abuse of power everywhere. No profession is exempt. By the time I was 20 years old, I was violated by teachers, counselors, doctors, law enforcement, and clergy. Being violated by authority figures is a different kind of violation. It kept me in my place. This kind of corruption keeps all victims in the margins of society. If they can't trust authority figures, who can they trust? I want to tell you a quick story. I will never forget this day. I was standing on a street corner one day. I did not want to be there. I wasn't even 20 years old, and I was still so naive. My trafficker was down the block watching me, and a van pulled up. And I noticed the driver was wearing a white clergy collar. I remember feeling so relieved to see him. I just knew he was going to offer me some help. That's just how naive I was. I looked back at my trafficker. He gave me the nod, and I eagerly approached this man's van. When he rolled down his window, I will never forget that warm smile. But when he offered me some money, I immediately became nauseated because the hopelessness at that moment was overwhelming. I know that was the day I accepted my fate, that I would never get off the street. Fast forward to 1983. I'm 28 years old, and I'm lying on a gurney again. Again, I was gang raped. But this time I was left for dead in an apple orchard. I did not want the police involved in this rape. I didn't want healthcare involved in this rape. I didn't call the police. Somebody else did, and I begged him not to. But even in my world of darkness, there was a kind detective who offered me a glimmer of hope. He questioned me at the hospital and said, "Hi, Ruth. I know you didn't ask for this life. You have rights, and we're going to get these guys." Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. I have rights. It took a while to wrap my head around that one. I ended up putting all my trust in this kind detective and in our legal system. And I told him everything. And I admitted that I got in the car with these men because I thought we were going to get some drugs. And again, this is another crime I never got justice for. When the police and healthcare were involved, I'm sure many said I had it coming. We have made a lot of progress fighting human trafficking, and law enforcement is being trained, and so is healthcare. And I finally did get some justice, April 24 of 2018, when the court finally acknowledged my victimization and expunged my prostitution charges. That was such a proud day for me because those charges haunted me for years. Back to 1988, when I was released from jail, I stayed with my 60-year-old mother. I was able to pay her rent money this time because I walked out of jail with a little money in my pocket from a lawsuit that I filed against a methadone clinic, when my counselor withheld my methadone from me until I submitted to his sexual demands. Once again, another authority figure who saw me as easy prey. And I got sick of it. I finally got mad. And I ended up snitching on him. I was always so afraid of that snitching label, but not this time. I passed a lie detector test, and we ended up settling out of court for only $10,000. And my lawyer got a third of that. But it was enough money to start anew. My trafficker was on his way to prison at the time, so I didn't have to hand over this money to any trafficker. Excuse me. And I didn't have to buy any drugs with it. And my family took me back in. So I bought me a $3,000 car. I signed up for a free computer class. I went on to get my GED. And I looked for work. And right away, I started counseling and Narcotics Anonymous meetings. I started counseling with a very kind counselor. He helped me take the blinders off. He helped me see that I am not beyond redemption, like I thought I was for so long, and like so many others thought I was. Knowing this is what helped me to forgive myself, which is what I really had to do to move forward. This is when I took step 2 of the 12-step program, which reads, "We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity." You have to remember, human trafficking wasn't even a word back then, and I couldn't admit prostitution to anybody, not even to this counselor. We focused on my drug addiction and finding a job. He convinced me that I am just as forgivable as the next person, and that there's a forgiving employer out there just waiting for me to apply. And he was right. He said, "Be honest on your application about your record, Ruth. The truth will set you free." I was hired to work at a local gas station as a cashier in 1989. And in 1992, I was hired to work for the government as a clerk, and that's where I retired from. God really made the way for me. But I did relapse after being clean for almost a year. And my mother put her own life on the line and rescued me from that drug house. From my research, I learned why I never relapsed again after that. It's because even at age 33, I finally got what I needed from my mother. She proved to me that I am worth fighting for. My mother died in 2013, right after I started this research. She ended up being my hero, and I ended up being hers in her old age. Growing up, my siblings and I saw violence as normal. We have come to forgive each other. Since we've been comparing notes, we're looking beneath the surface, and we're coming to understand each other a lot better. If it wasn't for my family, especially my 2 sisters, my sister Bonnie is with me here today, and if it wasn't for my therapist, I wouldn't be here today. I'll be spending the rest of my life trying to make up for all of those lost years. By sharing my victory story with you today, I'm taking step 12 of the 12-step program, which reads, "Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others and to practice these principles in all of our affairs." I have a few more life lessons I want to pass on, just a few more minutes. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration says there are 6 key principles to trauma-informed care. As you can see, safety is number 1. For as long as I can remember, I never felt safe with healthcare or law enforcement. Just walking into a healthcare facility felt like I was walking into a police station. And I believe I acquired that attitude starting at age 13, when I was interrogated by the police at the hospital, when all 6 of these key principles were missing. After the apple orchard rape, the kind detective did everything right. Even though he never got justice for me, his warmth and concern at the hospital helped me see law enforcement and my own trafficking situation in a different perspective. When he interviewed me for a second time, his patience and understanding motivated me to go forward. I don't remember everything that he said, but some of the things he said I will never forget. And I want you to know what he said. Hi, Ruth. I have to ask you some difficult questions because I need specific information. I know this is not going to be easy for you, so take your time. If we need more time, we can meet again tomorrow. He said, try to be as honest as you possibly can and tell me everything that you can remember. He must have known that trauma escapes language and causes memory loss. He was the first one that showed a genuine interest in my side of the story, and I spilled my guts to him the best way I knew how. Maya Angelou says there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I can attest to that. I told that detective everything. I know I wasn't a good witness. When traumatized victims, you have to remember, traumatized victims have a hard time being honest with even themselves because they carry an untold story inside them that even they can't make sense of or put into words. When the detective had the apple orchard rapist under heavy surveillance, I was arrested again. He had to come to the jail to tell me the bad news. But again, professional and respectful. He used direct and polite speech. He said, Ruth, I have bad news. I was forced to drop the investigation because the prosecutor feels we don't have enough evidence. I'm sorry, I did what I could. Of course, this was devastating news to me, and I cried and I cried. But looking back, I wish I would have held back the emotions and thanked him when I had the chance. I went years wanting to thank him. In 2015, my therapist told me that she knew the kind detective. He was retired, so I emailed him. She told me where he was working. I said, you may not remember me. He emailed me back and he said, I do indeed remember you. He said, I have had the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of many in my career, but you never know how much until you get an email like this one. My point is, this detective had the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of many in his career. Because he had no resources for himself, and because he had no resources to offer victims, I'm sure he felt beat down on his mission to protect and serve. Just as I felt beat down and lost all hope of ever escaping the hell that I was in. Today, 30 years later, I try to support victims who are still struggling or who are still trapped. And I find that they too are up against a broken system and a huge lack of resources. Even though I call it a broken system, it was that same broken system that helped me escape trafficking with that lawsuit. We simply need resources. We need the trauma-informed care to be implemented across the board to everybody who's fighting the good fight, who's on the front lines. Dr. Bezel van der Kolk, he has the perfect term for the difficult inner work I did. He calls it the reorganization of perception process. And I can attest to that. It is a process. For me, it was a very long process. It took years for me to get to where I'm at today. But I don't see it taking that long for the next generation because now we have the A.C.E. study. I have learned so much from the A.C.E. study, from therapy, and from being involved in anti-human trafficking work. Now I see my past, my present, and my future completely different. I see everything and everyone completely different. Victims and predators are everywhere. I have learned to navigate through life with my eyes and ears open. I have also learned to speak up. Don't get me wrong, I still have bad days, but I now have the support that I need. Thank you again, Madam Chair, for this opportunity, and members of the committee.
From the bottom of my heart, thank you.
You're welcome.
I heard your story just over 4.5 years ago and gave you a ride home, and you talked about every time you tell the story, you relive it. This takes so much strength, and it does not go unnoticed.
Thank you, Mary, but I do want to point out, the last time you heard me speak, I am speaking quite more strongly, don't you think? I was a mess the last time you heard
Yep,
me.
I didn't notice because I was such a mess. Yeah,
I have grown a
lot.
lot stronger, and I have to credit the ACE study for that, and my therapist and my family, and you, everybody that's in this work.
And the fact that you drew it into how to help other people through this process and to help us as legislators and families and neighbors what we can do to help make a difference for children. So thank you. Do any members have a question?